We're live, and today's discussion is going to be about the philosophy of science. Before I do say anything, give me just a second. I got to get my cat out of here. He's going to make a lot of noise. All right, that started off well. Chris, you should have entertained them while I was gone.
Sorry, I couldn't follow up with a cat.
Yeah, I was just starting this, and then Milo just started rustling in a paper bag. I mean, he just picks the best time to do that stuff. But just so you guys know, because I've been talking about my health some lately before I get started, I had some issues with my sinuses where I was getting a lot of sinus infections repeatedly. And I had to have surgery about 2 weeks ago, and I just got home last night from being at my parents' house for almost 2 weeks, recovering from that surgery. And the surgery went well, and I do feel better now, so hopefully I won't be having any more issues with that. And I do also appreciate all the believers and the unbelievers, too, that have been emailing me and asking me how I'm doing and everything, so I do appreciate that. But this video is going to be about the philosophy of science, and the title of the video is "Does Science Commit the Fallacy of Affirming the Consequent?" Now, as far as this video goes, it's going to be a little bit more broader than what the title insinuates. First off, I need to kind of explain what my position is on the philosophy of science, and then we'll get into how science commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. But also, I did have some atheist YouTubers that had responded to me, and also some people that responded to me in writing as well, concerning some of my positions on this issue. And in this video, we're going to be addressing some of those as well. So first, I'm going to go ahead and sort of explain my position on the philosophy of science. I am an operationalist. And an operationalist is a person that holds that science is useful, but it's not a means of obtaining knowledge or truth. And by knowledge, what I mean is a very specific definition that's used, in a philosophical sense, and that is basically knowing that which is true. It's not knowledge in a colloquial sense where you say, "Well, I know that my car is going to start tomorrow morning." It's not that kind of know where you know, but you're not sure about it. You just say that you know when you really. Whenever really you could think, you believe that that's something you can actually be wrong about. So when I talk about knowledge, I mean a very precise definition of knowledge. And for anyone who chooses to respond to this video, if you use any other definition besides the one that I'm giving, then you're equivocating. But I hold that you cannot reach any knowledge in an epistemic sense through the scientific method. But I do hold that as an operationalist, that science isn't useless. It is useful. It's just that we cannot know any proposition from science. Now, so a lot of people say, and especially a lot of Clarkians like myself will say, because of certain reasons, science is always false. But when we say that science is always false, what we mean by that is not necessarily that the science as a whole is false. We're not saying that science never reaches any true conclusions. But what we're saying, though, is that by the nature of science, science is not truth. So if it's not truth, then it must be false. That's our position on it. And to say that it is truth whenever it's not truth is basically a denial of the law of contradiction. And it's anybody who tries to incorporate and say, well, I mean, science is truth when it's not truth is really denying logic, and then they're left in a self-refuting skepticism. So I'm going to go into some of the reasons why I hold my position on science. The first reason is that science is inductive in nature. Initially, science uses inductive reasoning, and what inductive reasoning is that it takes a specific proposition and generalizes it into a wider proposition that's wider in scope. And a proposition is basically a statement, which is usually a declarative sentence, that can either be rejected or accepted. So, if I say something like Chris likes ice cream, Chris either doesn't like ice cream or he does like ice cream. Chris, do you like ice cream?
No.
No, he does not like ice cream. Yeah, he's not a guy for sweets. So, but But that's what a proposition is. So inductive reasoning will take a general a more narrow proposition, such as I saw a yellow duck, and then generalize it saying therefore all ducks are yellow. Now, ducks are all ducks aren't yellow, but that's just an example. And that's just the way induction works. It just makes a generalized statement. Now, but there's a problem with induction, and that is that induction is ultimately not justifiable. Induction cannot ultimately lead to knowledge. And again, by knowledge, what I mean is knowing that which is true. Since induction tells you what's probable or what's not probable, then it cannot be considered knowledge in the sense that you know that X is true. You can only know that X is probably true or X is probably not true. So, that being said, we're saying that that induction is only probably or true or not probably. You know, that a proposition arrived by induction is either probably true or probably not true. You would be not be saying that you actually know something. You would just be saying the probability of a proposition being true or not true. And then philosophers have struggled with the problem of induction. There's quite a few philosophers in the history of philosophy that don't think that the problem of induction has ever been solved. David Hume was the most notable philosopher that pointed out this problem. There have been philosophers that came along and tried to solve the problem. My position is it isn't solved. The only way you can actually justify induction is by using induction, and that's begging the question. It's a logical fallacy. And then if you're going to try and say that something that begs the question is something that we ought to accept, and it's not able to be axiomatic, then you just threw logic out of the window. So, and also, if someone tried to use induction as sort of an axiom of sorts, then there would be a problem, because if you use induction as an axiom, and that's your first principle. A first principle is your very first belief that you start with in your worldview. If you try and start with induction as a first principle, then we just wind up in an approximation of the truth, and then from the approximation of the truth that you start with, you never actually reach a proposition that something is actually true, because that's not what induction does. So someone saying that they just assume induction on the onset is actually contradicting themselves whenever they try and hold induction as a first principle. And I only say this because I had an atheist that tried to do that while arguing for induction before. Chris, is there anything you want to say about induction before we go on to the next reason why I think science isn't leading to knowledge?
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and give my portion on science. I believe that science is actually nothing more than a tool in the toolbox. You know, it's in there along with epistemology, philosophy, logic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not meant to be a worldview. The reason why I say it's not meant to be a worldview is because I've met people who claim that science is their worldview. But however, there's a problem. Science in and of itself, like you said before, is an inductive method. But however, for the people watching, I usually go by what's called the P=1 argument. It's Logic 101. Basically states that you have three parts. You have P=1, which means probability equals 100%, which means it's true. 100% cannot argue it. Then you have the second part, which is probability is greater than 0, but less than 1. That means you can have anywhere from 0.000 repeating zeros with a 1 at the end, percent to 99.99 repeating 9s at the end, percent certainty of something. And then you have probability equals 0, and that usually gets into semantics, but it usually goes wrong along the area of you can't be a married bachelor, or you can't have a hotel with an infinite amount of floors, things that cannot exist, just simply by definition in the same sense. The problem is with science and claiming science as a worldview is that when you say because science is induction, one cannot be achieved. In other words, probability cannot equal 100% with science because it is inductive. And so anybody that claims that science is their worldview immediately falsifies their worldview because ultimate knowledge cannot be attained in the world, but however, ultimate knowledge is obtainable. And they also use absolute statements for that. Anyways, does that make much sense, or do you need me to go a little further than
What's that?
that? Does that make much sense, or do you need me to go a little bit further than that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm sorry, I was running my chair for a second. My phone was dying, so I just wanted to put in the charger real quick. But so I agree with that, and just a similar issue to you. I've had a lot of people, whenever I talk to them about this topic, and they'll say, well, science is just an approximation of the truth. And we sort of run into the same problem there as we do with the problem of induction. If science is just an approximation of the truth, then then on a knowledge basis we can't consider science to be ultimately true, because if it's just approximation of the truth, if any part of the truth is false, then it's not true, is it?
Yeah.
So
No, I think you and I both, I think we have different terms. When you were saying that science does not lead to knowledge. I think that's where you and I were differentiating a few days ago when I spoke with you.
yeah, because you're still exploring this topic.
Yeah. Well, I believe that things have been discovered, thanks to science. But however, I do believe that science cannot lead to ultimate knowledge.
Let's talk about the nature of knowledge in science. Let's go ahead and cover that before we go on to the asserting the consequent portion.
Okay.
There's two ways of saying the word no. The first way of saying the word no is a more precise philosophical sense, which is I know this to be true. I not only do I know that this is true, I can tell you how I know it's true.
Okay.
With science, it's a little different, because whenever people say I know something, like let's say, like the example I gave earlier, I know my car is going to start in the morning, or your truck's going to start whenever you get up and go to school, but you really don't know that your truck is going to start. There's a possibility you could be wrong about that. So it's not really. So when you say I know my truck is going to start, you're using it in a more of a colloquial sense, which is basically saying that if you say that I know in a colloquial sense, you're really expressing an opinion. And because science doesn't get to you to capital T, I guess you could call it capital T truth, then science must be opinion. Because if science doesn't get you to capital T truth, but it gets you to an approximation of the capital T truth, where some part of that approximation is actually not true, then it isn't the truth. And then on an epistemic level, where you're talking about knowledge that I know something is true, and I can give an accountance for how I know it's true, then in that sense, it's false. But if you're talking about a more colloquial sense, where you're saying, well, I know I did an experiment, and I feel like my hypothesis was verified, and I'm going to give you all the reasons I think that this hypothesis best explains what I'm seeing here. It's called an inference, the best explanation. But that's a different kind of truth than what or knowledge than what I'm actually talking about. That's more of a general knowledge that's fallible. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with you. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that I'm just going to go ahead and say it's a term thing between me and you.
That's what it is. And like whenever you watch Seitz and Bruggencate debate David Silverman, remember that on how they answered the full video? How David Silverman said you're using two different definitions of knowledge.
Yeah.
I think that's why I think, or either knowledge or truth. I think he said knowledge. But that's an example. But it's funny because I get that a lot with atheists. Like I was talking to a guy named Ben Rosen not too long ago, and he told me that I was muddying semantics on terms. But what I was doing though is I was using these terms in a very precise sense, and it's ironic because whenever people accuse me of muddying the semantics, all of a sudden they're using a different definition of knowledge or truth than what I'm using.
Yeah, that's a
so then they become the one that's equivocating. What's that?
That's a semantic issue in and of itself. So.
Yeah, and that's the problem a lot of times whenever a presuppositionalist talks with an unbeliever or someone that's not really epistemologically self-conscious. They don't understand that whenever we're saying knowledge, we're using it in a very precise philosophical term, not one that's really not in a fallibilistic sense of knowledge. But I want to go ahead and get into the topic of the video about science asserting the consequent. This was another reason why I was saying that science doesn't actually lead to knowledge in the precise sense about propositions. And the fallacy of asserting the consequent goes by a certain logical deductive syllogism, which is basically if P, then Q, premise 2, Q, conclusion, therefore P. So that is a fallacy of asserting the consequent. And it's also known as affirming the consequent. So you can either say it's asserting the consequent or affirming the consequent. I like to say asserting because it's just easier for me to say, I guess. But as far as that fallacy is concerned, I've heard some objections, and I'm going to kind of explain how that the scientific method commits the fallacy as I go along. There was one atheist that responded to me, and he said, and he was saying that the reason why whenever I say science commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent, the only reason why I can demonstrate that is because I control the content of the antecedent and the consequent. Now, in the syllogism that I just gave, if P then Q, P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. The antecedent, P, is actually a conditional proposition. If P, then Q. You see that leading word then into Q, that means that Q is the consequent of P. Now, so we have if P then Q, premise 2, Q, therefore P. What this atheist said was that you can arrange the premises in the scientific method in the form of modus ponens. And modus ponens is a logically valid deductive syllogism. If P, then Q. Premise 2, P. Conclusion, therefore Q. And the problem that I have with that kind of response, saying, well, we can just arrange the premises of the scientific method. Whenever the scientific method does an experiment to try and confirm a hypothesis, you start with a hypothesis. Then you make a prediction. If that prediction comes to fruition, then the hypothesis is successful. So in the scientific method itself, you're starting with a hypothesis, and then you're trying to see if what you're predicting will occur happens in the experiment. If that prediction happens, then the hypothesis is considered successful. So we have a classic. If we have a classic example of the fallacy of asserting the consequent in the process of experimentation in science. So we have, let me say it this way: if hypothesis H is true, then prediction P will occur. Premise 2, prediction P occurs. I'm sorry, yeah, that's right. Prediction P occurs. Therefore, H hypothesis is successful. So we have a classic example, and when I say that science commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent, I'm talking about the process of experimentation within the scientific method. That's all I'm talking about. I've had some people say, well, science itself doesn't have is it self-logically deductive, and they're right about that. But when I say that science commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent, I'm saying that the experimental process within science is making it. So I'm just saying it. I guess maybe it might help for me to be more precise with my terms. But most philosophers of science will know what I'm talking about. Karl Popper said the same thing. David Hume pointed it out. So this is not this is not something that only Christian apologists say. And I've had some atheists that have responded that seem to imply that only Christian apologists say that science commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent. Do you have any comments on that, Chris, about trying to rearrange the experimentation flow of logical inferences into modus ponens?
No. Well, the way I don't always think in terms of P and Q. Now I do think in that sense. My thought process does go within that sense. If that makes any sense. Basically saying if X, Y, if this statement is true, we should see X, Y, and Z. We see X, Y, and Z. Therefore, this statement is true. Now, logic has labeled, or I guess logical philosophers have labeled it as a fallacy. the scientific method, yes, I do agree, does commit that fallacy wholeheartedly. Now, but however, because science has made uh, uh, breakthroughs, gone further down the line. It's made breakthroughs in technology, the medical field, blah 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 blah. I do think that I do want to open up the door and ask if maybe we're asserting the wrong idea, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Are we actually committing the fallacy? Because if we're actually committing the fallacy, then how is scientific knowledge advancing so quickly?
Right, and that's a good question. And the answer to that is that what I'm saying whenever I say that that science, you can get a true conclusion from a logically invalid syllogism. So you can but what we're talking about with the structure of the experimentation is um, is that whenever you have an invalid structure, whenever you're trying to draw a conclusion, and your structure is invalid, even if you reach a true conclusion, the structure itself isn't valid. So the problem is twofold. First off, if you use a logically invalid syllogism to reach a conclusion, and then you still say you're justified in holding that conclusion, even though the way you reached it was violated the rules of inference and logic by asserting the consequent, then you just basically threw logical inferences out of the window. You killed logic. That's really what it amounts to. But there is a second issue as well, which I just forgot. But yes, it may though. But you're right though. But you can reach a true conclusion from the syllogism. It's just that. Oh, now I remember what the second issue is. The second issue is that it's just not rational to try and reach conclusions from a logically invalid syllogism. If you were to try and do that, the only real justification that I think you would have for trying to do something like that is if you're just using science pragmatically and not in a sense to get like an epistemic, true, precise type of knowledge. So I guess that would be my answer to what you're saying.
Okay. Now, I'm not trying to play the devil's advocate. What I usually like to do is I like to put the other set of shoes on, or try to put myself in somebody else's situation. So if somebody's trying to defend science, then how would they be able to do it? But however, I don't think like everybody else. So I'm not gonna sit here and say I know exactly what an atheist is thinking, or an agnostic is thinking, or a humanist is thinking. But however,
and really, whenever someone's trying to defend science, in that instance, as being reaching the knowledge of something that's true, what they'll usually say is something like what you said. Well, even though this is a logically invalid process, that this conclusion has been very useful to us. This hypothesis that we tested and been using has produced results for us that are desirable. And I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree with the idea that science is useful. That's why I'm an operationalist in my science, in my philosophy of science. But what I would point out to them is that there are a myriad of models that were constructed prior to this century that turned out to be false. They were useful for a time, but they turned out to be false. Like for instance, you have Isaac Newton's law of absolute gravity and absolute time. That was provided useful for over a century, for a few centuries, I think. And then the theory of relativity sort of by Einstein blew that out of the water. But Isaac Newton's model was useful. You also have caloric chemistry too, which was also useful for a time and then turned out to be falsified and usurped by another more useful model. So usefulness is not something that guarantees that a proposition is true. Like, just to give a modern example, when you look at a television screen, especially a CRT screen, what your eyes are showing you is not really there. You're seeing a bunch of pixels that are being reconstructed, in an intelligible fashion by your brain, so that you're able to see what's on the TV. You're able to actually get intelligible information off of it, and that's useful. But the picture you're seeing is false. It's not really there. It's an illusion. So there are false things that can be useful. But then again, there's also things that are true that can be useful. So and so that being said, with all these useful things that have turned out to be false, you just can't argue that something is arrived at on a basis that isn't justified for knowing the hypothesis is can lead to knowledge in the precise sense. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think I could be satisfied with that one.
Okay. Yeah, I may have misspoke a couple of times on that, but I probably should have waited till tomorrow to do this. I just wanted to get this over with. I'm pretty tired though. I want to move on to the next objection. Someone else pointed. Whenever I say that science is false because it asserts the consequent, that therefore I'm committing a fallacy called the fallacy. And the fallacy is a mistaken reasoning that says that just because I think that something commits a fallacy, that it therefore must be false. And I never argue that. Whenever I argue that science is false, I use a cumulative case. That is one of the reasons I use, but I only use it to show that the process that science goes through to verify a hypothesis is not one that passes through the rules of inference and logic. It breaks the rules of inference. And on that basis, people, I would tell people that they're rejecting that basically whenever they're trying to say that something is that they're justified in knowing something's true despite reaching it in a logically invalid syllogism, they're actually denying logic. And you can't even have science without logic. So really when I say that science is false, I'm talking about the nature of science, about how science is based off of induction. For instance, with the first objection, when someone tried to arrange the form of the scientific method in the experimentation process in the modus ponens, one thing I'd want to point out is that any proposition that's being evaluated in that deductive syllogism was reached at through induction, and if induction is not a valid process for reaching knowledge, then that whole deductive syllogism is absolutely meaningless. If you can't even justify how you got the data that you're testing in your hypothesis, about how you can know that it's true, and then you try and do a deductive argument, valid or not, you're basically being inconsistent. Especially if you agree that induction can't reach any knowledge, and then you try and say that we're justified in saying that what we reach in science is knowledge. Because you have to, if you're going to try and be consistent in the way you acquire knowledge, you have to be consistent from your very first principle, throughout all your propositions, all your theorems, everything you adhere to has to be consistent with itself. And if you try and say that you can get if you try and get knowledge from induction to and then do an experiment from the knowledge that you say you got from induction, then you're contradicting yourself by saying that science can still lead to knowledge, because induction can't lead to knowledge. So if you can't even get started on the right foot, then how are you going to then how are you going to be able to say that you reach a conclusion that you can know justifiably in an epistemic sense? So in the short, induction, you cannot use induction to get to a deductive syllogism and then say that you have knowledge. It just doesn't work that way. You have to be consistent from the very first principle you have all the way up until the conclusion of the experiment, if you want to try and call it knowledge. But again, I don't say that science is false just because it commits a fallacy. I've never said that. That's one of the reasons I give. But I'm not saying that the fallacy in of itself makes a conclusion that science reaches false. If I said that science could reach no true conclusions at all, even from a logically invalid syllogism, that would be a fallacy. But that's not. I never ever said anything like that. So what I say is that the conclusion is not justifiably held to from the invalid syllogism. I'm not saying that the conclusion is false. So that's Chris, have you ever heard of that fallacy, the fallacy?
No, I haven't actually. That's why.
Yeah, I ran it. I've known about it for a while, but it, I've at first whenever I heard about it, I had trouble understanding it because I was thinking about, well, if we're going to throw the rules of inference out the window, but but whenever you look at the actual definition of fallacy, it said if you reject a conclusion because it was presented in a logically invalid form, then it's considered a fallacy. You could really confuse someone with that. If you say fallacy is a fallacy. Just say it 3 times fast.
Yeah, probably my head explode at some point.
There's another objection. This is one of the more common ones that I've run into, that people have brought up whenever I talk about science not being able to reach knowledge. Science is a process of falsification that uses modus tollens when hypotheses are tested. If a hypothesis is not falsified, we have warrant to accept it until shown otherwise. Now, what this does is it moves, whenever you try and convert the scientific method into a modus tollens form, you're taking it a step backwards. And you're still going to end up with a fallacy. It's just going to take you one more step to get there. So let's just say that I have a hypothesis, right? And I say, okay, and I say, okay, and I use modus tollens to falsify the hypothesis. There's a problem. Science is a process of falsification. And that's what the atheist said. I agree with that. But if science is a process of falsification, then how are we going to confirm any true propositions in science? If science only falsifies, then how are we going to say that any proposition is justifiably held to? How are we going to say that evolution is justifiably held to? We wouldn't be able to, because science only falsifies things. If science only falsifies things, it can't confirm evolution. If you try and confirm evolution in an epistemic sense, then you commit the fallacy of asserting the consequent. So I agree that science can falsify a hypothesis. I just don't agree that science can confirm one. Now, if someone says that they're justified in holding a hypothesis because it hasn't been falsified yet, then we run into the same fallacy. Premise 1: if the hypothesis isn't falsified, then I'm justified in believing it. And if you say that if the hypothesis, well, let's put it this way: if the hypothesis is justifiable, then we're justified. Is not falsified by modus tollens, then we're justified in believing the hypothesis. Premise 2: the hypothesis was not falsified by modus tollens, therefore we're justified in believing the hypothesis. And then that's going to do the very same thing as what asserting the consequent does. So by saying that, you're actually committing the fallacy, because you're saying that, well, if it doesn't if it doesn't get falsified by modus tollens, then I'm justified in believing it. It just does the same thing. It just takes 2 steps to get there instead of 1. Also, there was a question that an atheist YouTuber asked. He asked, what scientist or logician would construct an argument for a hypothesis in a fallacious manner, such as asserting a consequent? Ironically, there's an evolutionist named Kenneth Miller on the video of How to Shut Up Pesky Creationists that talks about the chromosome fusion, and he commits to fallacy in that video. So to answer that atheist question, that's Kenneth Miller's one guy that explains it. I hear scientists explain hypotheses and how they justify in this fallacious manner all the time, and that's usually because scientists are they study the first order discipline of biology or astronomy or physics or something. A lot of them don't study the philosophy of science, and that's why we end up with some of these scientists that may be good scientists, but they're really horrible philosophers. Like Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss. There's just a lot of scientists out there that just are not good philosophers.
Right, I agree with you.
So, but I think that's all of the objections I've heard so far from atheists. I just wanted to do a video to respond to some of them. Like I said, I probably should have waited because I was pretty tired tonight and my mind's not all here, but It's just something I've been wanting to get done for a while, and I was recovering from surgery in the past 2 weeks, so I couldn't do it. Chris, is there anything else you want to add to this?
Just one minor thing. I think I'm going to backtrack a little bit here.
What's that?
I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. Basically, with what you were saying before, what because of falsifications within the hypothesis, we can accept something that to be true at the time. Did I come close to what you said before?
Yeah, what I was talking about was modus tollens is a logical syllogism that falsifies a proposition, and someone said that, and I'll just reiterate it because I think I misspoke when I stated it before. Let's just give the argument again. If a hypothesis is not falsified by modus tollens, we are justified in holding to it. The hypothesis is not falsified by modus tollens. Therefore, we have reason to believe it. And a lot of times, what they'll say is that we have reason to believe this hypothesis unless shown otherwise. But really, that's not a kind of precise knowledge that I'm talking about with the philosophy, in the philosophy of science. I'm talking about a precise type of knowledge that says you can know that something is true. And that's not the kind of, and whenever they're trying to say something like that, they're talking about a more colloquial type of knowledge, or say, well, I think this is true, but I could be wrong about it. That's an opinion. That's not knowledge. And it's very important that we make a distinction between knowledge and opinion when we talk about these topics. But yeah, but that basically, though, you're right, though. They are saying that that if something's not falsified, then we have justification for believing it unless said otherwise.
Okay. The one little tidbit I wanted to throw in there was, and this is probably like a lot of people would consider this a beginner's argument. But however, people don't really look at this too deeply, and I encourage everybody that's watching today to look into this. People that let's take an old Earth position real quick. People had said before that the Earth was millions of years old. Now they say it's billions of years old. Back at the time when they said it was millions of years old, they said that we know the Earth is millions of years old. Today they say that they know that it's billions of years old. So were the people actually, were the guys who said the Earth was millions of years old actually justified in believing what they said? If they were justified, well, that would be a false sense of knowledge.
That's right.
Because that means that they were not right at the time, but however they said they knew that the Earth was millions of years old.
Right. And that's the nature of opinions, is that you have a proposition you hold to, but you really can't prove that it's true. Or really, not really, you can't prove that it's true, but you can't show any justification for not only do you not know that it's true, but you can't show any justification for believing it's true. And if you don't know something's true, you're not going to be able to justify believing in it. And that's the nature of opinions. Opinions change. Opinions, you get correct. You change. It just happens. People change opinions. Some people start off Republican in their life, they go Democrat. Some people don't care and they don't do either. But it's all opinion. And and we have to be careful to not try and say that things that are opinion is something that we can say is knowledge. And that's how a lot of philosophers try and weasel out of this problem of skepticism. They start using knowledge in a more of a they'll hold the fallibilism or something where you say, well, we can be justified in knowing things, but we could be wrong about it. And if you can be wrong about it, it's just an opinion. It's not knowledge.
Correct.
Now you can have opinions. That's fine. Just don't call it knowledge.
Yeah, that's one thing that I say to evolutionists from time to time, who say that they know that molecules demand evolution is true. Well, I hate to break it to you, but this is number one. Science is an inductive process. Two, you're using a historical science where you're actually making a guess or an assumption based off your presupposition. So therefore, 100% certainty of something cannot in those particular areas cannot be achieved.
Right.
So saying that
that's the crux of it.
Sorry.
Yeah, it just seems like the only way secular philosophy has really been able to deal with the problem of skepticism about how we can know things is to try and redefine knowledge. It's really ridiculous. So,
Yeah.
um,
Let me finish my sentence here. Uh, Basically, what I was trying to say was that you can say that you believe it to be true. You can say that uh, we uh, we have strong reason to believe that it's true. But however, you can't call molecules demand evolution a fact. And in the same sense, I'm not going to walk around and say, well, creation's a fact. I can't. In all honesty, I believe it to be true. Why? Because it's in the word. It's in the Bible. It's the plain reading of the Bible. I will never say that it is a 100% fact because I can't using the same logic.
and we're not bashing science. We're just trying to get people to be aware of the epistemological limitations.
Oh no,
Because if we go around like how some of the new atheists are doing and try and say, well, science is the ultimate arbiter of truth, that is going to kill science.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, you can't replace. I mean, if you say something that's absolutely true and you stop investigating it, a hypothesis, or to see if you can find something more useful, then we're stuck. So really, I think that the new atheist way of looking at science is very detrimental to what science is good at, and that's manipulating nature for our benefit. We have medicine, and then we used it to. I had surgery 2 weeks ago, and some people emailed me and said, "Don't you think that science is always false?" And I said, "No." I said, "Not in the sense that the conclusions are always false." I had, but what I'm saying is that science isn't true because of the necessity of its own nature within the sense of epistemic knowledge. But I can opine that some parts of science is true. Like, for instance, it's my opinion that Ohm's law was probably correct, but I can't prove that Ohm's law is correct. I just opine that it's correct. And like I said, and people can talk about opinions. You can argue for opinions. And usually when you argue for an opinion, like what you said, Chris, you're going to try and argue for what you think is the most reasonable one. But in the end, all that's still opinion too.
Right. And you're always going to argue for your presupposition as well.
Right. So, but someone asked me. They said, "Don't you?" And I thought it was funny. I was wondering if someone's going to ask me about this. They said, "Don't you have a low view of science? But you're still going to get surgery anyway." And the reason why I got surgery is because I'm a pragmatist when it comes to science. I'm an operationalist, so I just say, that we're just trying to benefit nature to our benefit, and science surgeries help other people. So I figured I'd give it a try. I don't know that it's going to work, but I thought I'd try it because everything else doesn't seem to have worked so far. So there's no inconsistency in me getting surgery for that one person that emailed me about that. But I laughed when I read that. I had someone ask me a similar question back whenever I had just gotten rid of my cancer. Another atheist asked me a similar question. So for anybody that had wondered that when they heard about my health news, that's my answer. But I really think that's all I have to say here. Is there anything else you want to say, Chris?
No, that's it for me.
All right. And just so you guys know, Chris is part of the Answers for Hope team. You can look at our at answersforhope.org and click on the Answers for Hope team logo and see his testimony and everything. So he is part of Answers for Hope, just like I am. Another thing, too, if anyone has any questions or follow-up comments, because I do typically disable my YouTube comments as soon as I'm able to, because they're just like all the trolls start pouring in whenever I do videos, and I just don't want to referee. But if anyone has any questions or comments, or they want to challenge me on anything, they can go to our website and click on the Q&A button and then ask us a question. It's our question and answer section. And or you can email me at answersforhope@gmail.com as well, and I try and respond to every email. If someone's really mean-spirited or something, I'm not going to give it the time of day, because I have other people that want to speak with me that are asking sincere questions. So I guess if you email me or send me a question, be polite. But that's about it. So for all you guys that have watched, I appreciate you guys watching. I hope that this video was edifying and cleared up some of the issues concerning the philosophy of science. If anyone has any questions, just send me an email. Thanks.